So on July the 29th, 3 young girls were stabbed in a Taylor Swift-themed dance class here in the UK. And it started in Southport, but of course it led to massive unrest all across the country. And the media had a part to play in this. The media was covering the events, and some have even gone as far as to blaming the media for some of the disinformation we actually saw. So I'm joined today by Cleo, who's a media professional, and we just thought we would go into some detail about how the media handles, crime, hate crime, how it reports hate, and I suppose how complicit the media is sometimes in fanning the flames of hate, if you like. So let's start with just addressing, I guess, the first big issue, which is how do you think the media handles, reporting on crime, reporting on hate crime here in the UK?
Yeah, so I think one thing we should definitely say is when we're talking about the media, we're talking about traditional media.
Yeah.
So we're talking about newspapers, we're talking about broadcasters who now all exist on social media, but that's kind of where they started, and that's where lots of people felt that they were jumping on what was happening online, all of those conversations. I think one of the things I would say is that as a journalist, you are trained that speed matters. And being the first out, the first person to have the headline, the first person to make it onto social media and say and have the authority to say this is what's happening, that is kind of how the traditional media is told is what's valuable. And that's kind of where the issue happens, because in this case, things were updating every 10 minutes, every 15 minutes. People were posting, people were resharing, and suddenly it was almost out of control. When you have that kind of speed, how much time then do you have to check your sources, to ensure things are accurate and trustworthy? That's kind of where the traditional media starts to have an issue. It's if you want to make sure you've done your due diligence, then it's going to take longer, and then you're not first, and you're not winning the clicks, and you're not winning the eyeballs on your content.
It's fascinating because we've seen some really rich people, billionaires, tweeting things or sharing things on X, saying, well, you're the media now. We are all the media, right? And in a certain sense, it feels empowering to be wow, I'm the media. But at the same time, when you've got someone on the ground taking a picture, sharing something that they have not verified, they have not gone through an editor, they haven't gone through legal to make sure you can even say these things. Do you think there is a problem as well about how democratized civilian journalism actually is, in that those hoops you normally jump through to get things right sometimes aren't actually there anymore?
Yeah, I think it's a hard one. I think on the one hand, it's great that it's democratized, right? It's great that everybody now has this sense that, I can say what I want, I can talk about things that are happening in my life, and people are going to know about it. However, I think we are seeing that people still do value those traditional markers of authority. So if you have a degree, or if you are a doctor, people trust you, because you have done the training. And I think that's maybe a little bit where the traditional media has fallen behind, is reminding people of that education aspect of there is training behind this. There is a level of what is right, what is wrong, what are the legal consequences? And as a journalist, you're required to work within that framework. Whereas everybody else, yes, please post, please share, please still be a part of that conversation. But perhaps there needs to be a wider discussion of, okay, maybe we value, I don't want to say a media because now it has become so polarizing, but whether it's the BBC, whether it's New York Times, whether it's The Guardian, whether it's the Daily Mail, perhaps there should be a greater value than just Joe Blogs who lives down the street.
And the reason why this is really important is because if we think about the context in a bit more detail, of course, the Southport riot, which is particular to, the UK, Wales, but also we saw protests in Manchester, we saw counter protests as well. All of that seemed based fundamentally on the wrong premise, right? Because the Southport riots were fueled by misinformation about where the attacker's from, essentially his background. Folks were saying he came here, he was a migrant that came here, but then we found out later he was actually born here. Folks were he hates the UK, but turns out he's been raising money for charity, supported. So this kind of complex and nuanced story got reduced to a bunch of headlines. So what part do you think the media can play in mitigating these tensions, or actually, or do you think sometimes they actually are the ones who are fanning the flames, because that sort of antagonistic framing really does well for clicks?
Yeah, and I am gonna start there. At the end of the day, these media organizations are businesses, and that is kind of where there is this push and pull, because they want people to click on their content, and it's kind of why places like the Daily Mail are so successful. It's they're learning really quickly what audiences want, and let's give more to them of exactly that. It's about algorithms. It's about making sure exactly you have people on your content reading it. I think on the other side, as I said, it is a hard one, but I think there does need to be a conversation around kind of how much value are we putting in the news articles and the conversations that are happening after. I would argue that what happened with these riots arguably could have been set off in a multitude of ways, and it's because people feel a certain way in the UK right now. And arguably maybe the mainstream media the traditional mainstream media aren't showing and talking to those people, and we're not having those conversations about why was that able to happen. So yes, the responsibility is for the traditional media to go into those communities and continue to have that conversation even past this dramatic headline. I think that's the issue. It's we have a huge headline in, no offense, an area that doesn't typically get that much media.
And Southport is lovely.
Southport is lovely, but it's not typically part of that kind of mainstream headline. We often get the same things that come out. Maybe we need to go back in there and have more conversations so people feel like they're being represented. And so when these things happen, it's not just, it's because this person and this person are saying this on X and on Instagram and on LinkedIn and wherever else. There might be a little bit more of well, actually, let me check what, the BBC or ITV are saying.
Yeah.
Because they're part of the conversation already, rather than they just come in and report and leave again.
Yeah. Now, as someone who works in the media, I see this all the time, but we all know it's an observable reality that trust in mainstream media, or in the mainstream media or legacy media or traditional media is starting to drop. It has been dropping over the last 20 years, but in the last few years, it seems as though things has really sped up and exacerbated. And now you're seeing the rise of lots of alternative media, right? And I think local communities in Manchester, communities in Southport are equally turning to maybe individuals, or they're turning to kind of, people who set up their own thing on YouTube, they set up their own thing on Telegram, whatever it is, and they're telling us the news. What's your thoughts on that? This kind of rise of the alternative, rise of the individual sort of news barons, if you like.
Yeah, I think it would be wrong of me to kind of say that they shouldn't exist, because I did just say this democratization is such a great thing. I just think we therefore have to hold them to the same standards as traditional media. There are legal consequences. When you study journalism, you do media law. You understand what you can and can't say about certain things, and they have to be held to the same standard. I also would argue it's it shows that people want to invest in a person. They want your story. Yes, they want to understand the news, but they want your perspective because they trust you and they know something about you. I think the problem is that often traditional media hasn't been investing and encouraging good personal practices. We've had very high profile cases across traditional media, phone hacking from, quite a long time ago, but more recently, very high profile presenters, reporters not being good, upstanding citizens. And so that's also kind of a bit of a tension. It's of course you're going to trust somebody who, has made it from nothing, underdog, and seems trustworthy. You want to put your time, your money, your energy into watching that, rather than these people on the news who, arguably maybe earn loads of money and don't deserve it.
It's been so interesting to see the rise of platforms like Substack, like YouTube, podcasts, who are playing a massive role in just reshaping how people consume media in general. I speak to some young people sometimes, and I'm saying, how do you know what's happening? I listen to a podcast. And it's interesting, those podcast structures, because oftentimes it's one guy, maybe a producer, and a guest. And so there is no team checking things meticulously, or, as you said, no one going through legal to say, is this right? And also the incentive structure seems to be set up for people to say the wildest thing possible to get people going. And so, again, if we just anchor it back on Southport, we had people like Andrew Tate, Tristan Tate, his younger brother. We even had people like Elon Musk sort of retweeting and sharing and saying, have you seen what's happening in the UK? The UK has been taken over by, they're saying these things. And a part of me wonders if what's happening is, okay, because the media, or we just kind of agreed that the mainstream media and the legacy media, clearly they have some foibles. Are people sort of chucking the baby out with the bathwater and saying, let's just do away with that. Let's just have these individuals, and not really considering the real harm that can be done by tweeting, where's this kid from? Suspicious. And it's like, no, it's not suspicious. He's a UK citizen. He was born here. But again, it's just a tweet to him. And I doubt he's really thinking or really considering how his tweet led to actual actions where communities, again, like Manchester, like Liverpool, we're actually seeing people smashing up shops, people smashing up mosques. You're seeing the real impact of a very online thing.
Yeah. There's a lot to unpack there. I think a really good one right at the end, as you said, is like this online and offline world. I think it is intertwined, but also quite separate. And I still think there are a lot of learnings to work out. Yes, and inevitably, so much of what was happening online, therefore, did start to be seen in real life. There was the riots, like that is a fact. However, I think we can do more work. There is more work to be done to really unpick. Okay, yeah, like there was all this misinformation, but kind of like lots of older people aren't on Twitter and watching all of that like unfold over 10, 15, 20 minutes. And like there's other things going on. There are other kind of like influences that are happening that I think we need to fully understand it, and by going into those communities. The other one in terms of, yes, podcast, YouTube, I would argue like traditional media kind of needs to catch up and needs to meet people where they are and needs to be the best. I think like you can no longer just assume someone's going to click on you because you have this logo that people recognize and because their parents and their grandparents and your great-grandparents have always trusted it. It's now about being really, really good so that people go, oh, that was a really good podcast episode. I'm going to subscribe. I'm going to keep listening. And that's how you can regain trust. It's not just, oh, well, like people have always trusted us, so they always will. You have to be the best, and then people will keep coming back. That's
a really good point. And just to land it home, this mistrust point, of course, it becomes one of those things that people say all the time. But, a 2024, so this year, a Reuters Institute for the study of journalism showed that only 34% of people in the UK actually trust the mainstream news media, and that's down from 50% just a decade ago. So it is being expedited, this distrust, and it does make me wonder whether people are now trusting these new sources they're going to, or if there's just general mistrust of everything, right? Because that's scary to me, because of course, if you live in a community, you've got buy-in there, you've got cachet there. That is where you live. That's where your children go to school, maybe. And so you have to ask, like, how are people getting their information? Because Elon Musk isn't going to be tweeting about Longsight or tweeting about what's happening in Levenshulme. Like, he's not going to be tweeting about what's happening in Newport. Like, he's not on the ground. So, like, what's happened to local news and local people and all that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think unfortunately it kind of comes down to money. And unfortunately, lots of these traditional local media outlets have just been squeezed out, and people aren't able to live and kind of have a wage and kind of be comfortable and have a level of stability by working for these media outlets. And I think that's actually a really big issue, because I think that's where you bring trust back. Yes, we have, the national BBC or national ITV or national Channel 4, but they also have local reporters on the ground in different regions. You can have the East or the West or the South or Scotland or Wales. And I think that's really important because it makes people feel like, okay, I have ownership and like someone cares and I have a voice. Like I will, despite the fact that I've, you know, I'm very happy that we're seeing this democratization and anyone can be on social media and anyone can kind of like report and be that kind of local journalist. Journalism, and in that traditional sense, I really do think is a center of democracy.
Correct.
And the more we begin to kind of chip away at it and see these local journalists like not be able to make a living, have to move to London, just go into a different industry because it pays better, we're just going to see it like it's just going to be more and more difficult for politicians, for just everyone to be able to come together. And I think, as you said, we're all becoming more and more extreme. There's more and more voices. It's hard to know kind of even where the middle ground is anymore. So I guess my encouragement would be that we need to make a new, I don't know how, and I don't have all the answers, but we need to make a new way of kind of somehow monetizing and ensuring that local journalists and local media continue. There are various ways that people are approaching that. Some of that includes private money, which then gets a little bit kind of complicated because the whole point of journalism is that it's this idea that you are non-biased, but hopefully we'll get there in the end if we all work towards it.
Yeah. And, you know, there's a stat I was reading, which, you know, to your point, you know, this is from Impos Mori, again, just from last year. It showed that 56% of UK citizens believed the national media coverage contributes to divisions in society, which is interesting because I remember having this experience where I was watching this podcast or the launch of this new podcast, and they were saying, on this podcast, we're going to talk about the big ideas. And I thought, what happened to the small ideas? You know, why is everything about left wing, right wing, and these sort of massive broad stroke conversations? What about the nuanced stuff about what's happening in my local community that I live in, right? During the Southport riots, Manchester Evening News and papers like that were reporting and talking about the nuances and how it might affect Manchester and what's happening in Manchester and things like that. And you just wonder if we need to almost kind of press pause on these big national debates that we always have and focus a bit on our community and what's happening in our community. You know, where are the papers reporting on local grants for the up-and-coming entrepreneurs in that local area, or a new center that's opening, or what's happening with, you know, this is going to sound really trivial, like bin collection, which I've become very interested in recently. You know, what's happened to those local papers, and how do we really strengthen, you know, those local outlets that are doing amazing work? There's actual journalism. It's not just debates on left-wing, right-wing issues. You know, how can we support them?
Oof. I guess I would just encourage people to being interested in their community. Like, I think especially in London, like, we are so London-centric, and it's so what's happening in Number 10 and what's happening in Westminster. And actually it's kind of like, well, what's happening at the end of your road? You know, exactly that. Like, what's happening with your bin collection, and like what's happening with the local bus and the local health center. And I think we often get so lost in these big debates, and it's kind of like, but how is the experience for you, and how is the experience for your neighbor, and what locally can change to make that better? That then, though, that becomes, though, a bigger topic, because then it does become political, and it becomes, okay, how does that look, and do we encourage a divestment of kind of authority, and do we encourage local councils to take more money? And so it does become a little bit political in that sense. But I think very, very kind of small level, it's like we used to have so many community groups within villages and everything else, and I think they do still exist. They've often just morphed and changed and have different kind of affiliations now. And I guess I would encourage people, like, if you really want to change the world, you're probably going to see the most changes if you do it locally and do it in your community. And you can still be connected to the world through your mobile phone. And then I think we'll start to see that change, because people then will buy their local newspaper because they'll care about what's in it, and they'll want to know about the local grants or the changes in the bin collection, or, you know, kind of a great success that the local school did. But people have to care. And I think that's really where we have to bring people back to. It's like lots of people say, oh, I don't care about politics. But if you ask them about bin collection or the pothole in the road, they care about that.
Absolutely.
So it's about linking it back to things that people care about.
I think these riots we saw this year, but also just, you know, whether it's the bombings in Manchester years ago, you know, it really just shows you, and they're a case study really in how the mainstream media, legacy media, and new media interact in this age of misinformation that we're in. To your point, you know, you can send a tweet and, you know, suddenly everyone. But the premise of the unrest we saw in the summer was actually faulty, and for me, it really showed one major thing, which is the need for just, if we're going to strengthen a community's resilience to hateful extremism, if we're going to strengthen how a community can deal with, you know, hate crime or even aggravation, you have to invest in their ability to have like news media literacy. And I don't mean that in a patronizing way. I mean, it is quite difficult actually to tell what's true and what's not true. And if you have no clue about how to really, you know, spot a headline or spot emotional manipulation or see when something's been taken out of context or see how polarization is driving, if you like, the kind of us versus them narratives. If you've never heard of these terms, it's quite hard. And so my big takeaway before I ask you for yours really is we have to invest in people's ability to actually decipher and distill information in this age of just misinformation, essentially. What's your takeaway when you look at the media landscape in the UK?
I completely agree with you there. I think people really do need to be given more tools about how to kind of, kind of traverse this new media landscape. I would also go back to that comment about traditional media just needs to be the best. Like, you can't, if you make a mistake, you have to be upfront and you have to say it as soon as possible. And you can't keep trying to protect people. You have to try and walk in, sounds very cliche, but walk in the light. You have to always be pursuing being the best. And it's really tiring and it takes a lot of energy, but I think it will pay off in the long run. And I think finally, education, investing in that, being the best and ensuring that if you are a traditional media, you're standing in the light and kind of being on the right side of history and making sure that you're balanced and non-biased. And I think the final one would be the community aspect. And I think it's about getting people kind of excited about what's happening around them and not just, oh, I don't care about politics and I don't care about this. People do care about stuff. People want to have fulfilling lives. And it's just reminding them that has knock-on effects across the country.
Thank you for being on.
Thank you for having me.